Hey everyone, so let's discuss belief number 3, using a positive approach. So far we've talked about believing the potential to change. That was the first belief. And to bring out that potential, we need an ideal learning environment that coaches the whole person. That was belief number 2, using a positive approach, belief number 3. So remember, we're still answering the question, how do we go about tapping into someone's potential for change? And let me come out of the gate saying that using a positive approach by no means that we are tiptoeing around someone's limitations or their weaknesses. We're not being soft here. We are confronting someone's limitations straight on. Using a positive approach just reminds us about the order of operations. We start with small wins, we like to call it. We start with what the person can do. We utilize their strengths to influence their weaknesses. So we start an objective summary, for example, with movements that they do really well or mobility that they have that's phenomenal. So for example, I might be talking to a client who we want to work on their thoracic mobility, but instead of jumping right into that, I might say, well, let me tell you, Susie, your hip mobility is phenomenal. I could probably use some of that for myself and some of my other clients. And your ankle mobility is also pretty solid. However, you rotate a lot better in your upper back to your left than you do to your right. I want to help you get some of that back so that we can really strengthen your push, pull, whatever her goals are. So it's about starting with what they're doing well. And this allows us to empower them to foster any type of change that we're trying to get after. Another example would be, we start a session with a simple question. Okay, Susie, what went well with your program this week? What seems to be getting easier? Is there anything that you feel is smoother after practice? Followed by, okay, Susie, what didn't go well this week? What do we have to tweak? What do we have to change? What do we might have to regress? And it's successively pairing small wins together that can ultimately help us create an empowering environment to help this person create momentum for change, especially if they're confronted with some emotional barriers. So to me, this is how we take potential energy and we convert it into kinetic energy by helping our clients tap into the skill of gratitude, or we help them see themselves in a more positive light that can literally ignite a fire within them. So this is a lot easier said than done because we are conditioned and we are professionally trained to highlight weaknesses, to find dysfunction. And in the insurance model, for example, we have to find an outcome measure that highlights a poor score so that we can justify medical intervention. Not a whole lot of positivity there, is there? So writing this reflex of jumping into a negative or jumping into a dysfunction is something that we have to consciously work on. And this belief of using a positive approach just helps check ourselves when we're in the moment with clients. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about my training in PNF because, believe it or not, PNF is not just about patterns and contract, relax. The 3 beliefs that we're talking about, the potential to change, coaching the whole person, and using a positive approach, actually comes from PNF. And as PNF clinicians, we are trained to articulate what the patient is doing well before we ever talk about dysfunction. And if you've worked with patients who have had a spinal cord injury or a stroke and have had some type of paralysis, neurological paralysis, you know that sometimes identifying positives or anything that's going well in terms of movement can sometimes be very hard to do. If we think about that for a second, take a step back and just imagine having a stroke, losing your ability to walk, losing your ability to control your own bowel and bladder function, getting out of bed by yourself. Imagine the loss of identity that someone experiences when they go through that devastating situation. And now imagine them being treated by a clinician or a group of clinicians, and they're trying their best to move well and to do what the clinicians ask them to do. Yet all the clinicians or all the clinician is identifying are things that aren't, or that they aren't doing well, things that they want to change. Imagine what that would feel like. And imagine what that would do to someone's motivation to move, let alone exercise. Well, then my question is, why should that be any different when we're dealing with orthopedics, sports medicine, and fitness? As PNF clinicians, in such a devastating situation, we're trained to identify positives. Why aren't we doing that in orthopedic, sports medicine, and fitness? Are we still not dealing with human beings who are trying to regain a sense of their identity? Don't we all like genuine positivity, compliments, and encouragement before we are bombarded with advice and criticism? I think a positive mindset is literally the fertile soil that allows us to overcome any gruesome challenge when it comes to a physical or a mental challenge. So if we think back to the previous belief and what we talked about in terms of Rita's story, a positive approach actually helped me help Rita with the help from Mike Roberts, because we played to her strengths and we utilized her strengths to influence her weakness. And the use of positive language, again, we're tapping back into belief number 2, using positive language to push someone down the empowerment path in Vlaien's model that we discussed in belief 2 as well. All of that is encompassed into a positive approach in this belief. So you can see the redundancy between a positive approach and coaching the whole person as we really try to tap into someone's potential for change. Next up, I'm going to tell you guys a story about a patient of mine that I treated in Vallejo, California, under one of my amazing mentors, Terry. And this story really highlights for me the power of a positive approach. Okay, Pete's story. Pete was a patient of mine in Vallejo, California, and Pete was 16 years old. He had a rare condition called neurofibromatosis, which is basically a genetic condition where the brain, the spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, there's just tumors everywhere. And this condition left Pete paralyzed. He was unable to speak, communicate, unable to roll over in bed. He had a power wheelchair, and we essentially had to transfer him from the bed to the wheelchair and vice versa using a Hoyer lift. I was extremely overwhelmed by this case. I remember when this case was assigned to me, I immediately felt my heart racing. Luckily, Terry was a mentor of mine at PNF. We called her the Queen because she was just a magician. And she helped calm me down, and she sat down and she said, "Listen, Ramez, right now Pete is literally dependent for all functional tasks. So let's keep it simple. Let's make our goal to help Pete have some level of independence with bed mobility. So right now he's completely dependent for a Hoyer lift setup. Let's work on rolling from supine to prone to give him some level of control again." That immediately calmed me down, and I was like, that's a great idea. So I went into treatment planning, and Terry was always there when I was treating Pete. We always co-treated Pete. And sometimes we actually had a couple other senior clinicians on the case. There was 3 of us. And I remember just going into deep treatment planning mode. we were using scapular patterns and pelvic patterns and trying to tap into any level of treatment strategies to help Pete roll from supine to prone. I vividly remember this. Anytime we would do a scapular or pelvic pattern, he would immediately go into extensor tone. And it was as if a lock just came on from the central nervous system. Nothing was able to move. You had to be very intricate and very gentle with the treatment. To make a long story short, I kept failing miserably. And I was just so frustrated because I felt useless, essentially. And then after treatment one day, I remember Terry looking at me and saying, "Ramez, let's go in the back and let's talk. I have an idea." It's like I was getting ready for the best mobility stability lecture in my career. And Terry sat me down and she said, "All right, Ramez, from now on, we're going to try not to use the word no when we're treating Pete." I looked at her and I said, "Terry, what do you mean not using the word no?" She said, "Ramez, I want you to pay attention to when you're treating Pete, be mindful how often you use the word no when his movements don't meet your expectations." I was like, okay. And she left it at that. So we went into the next treatment session the next day, and immediately I recognized my reflex reaction of saying no every time Pete didn't move in the way, the pelvic pattern was supposed to be or the scapular pattern was supposed to go. And I remember catching myself each time and then looking over to Terry and her just having this like motherly like smile and head nod because we identified something that was pretty extraordinary. And I didn't really understand the implications of it until after that treatment session. Terry took me to the back again, and she said, I first of all said, "Terry, oh my God, I didn't realize how many times I was saying no." And I must have said about to say no like 20 or 30 times in a 45-minute session. And she said, "Yeah, Ramez, you have to realize that people at this level of function, they are dealing with so much negativity throughout their day. I mean, they cannot do anything for themselves. And the word no, nope, or even just humming the word mm-mm has such a negative connotation associated with it, it can dramatically affect their motor planning strategy and the way they actually move." So here's a technique that I found very helpful, Ramez. I want you, every time you are about to say the word no, replace that behavior by simply articulating the movement that the client or Pete just did, and then say, "Now let's try to move like this." So if, let's say I wanted Pete to move this way, but he moved that way. So I would basically, Terry had me say, "All right, Pete, good. That's moving in this direction." We actually moved in that direction a few times. And then I would say, "All right, Pete, now let's try to move in this direction." It sounds so simple, but simple is not always easy. Well, I tried that strategy the next session with Pete, and it was unbelievable. The same exact treatment strategy, the same exact plan. Nothing changed other than that one thing. Replacing the word no with the technique we just talked about. Pete started moving differently. He was actually engaged and he was actually demonstrating some level of coordination. I mean, I'm telling you, before that technique that Terry taught me, he would almost always go into some level of extensor tone, and his neurological system would just lock up and we wouldn't be able to move anything. And then just this simple coaching strategy all of a sudden allowed us to tap into certain movement options that didn't even seem viable in the previous sessions. And I looked at Terry and I was, again, this is why we call her the queen, right? I was expecting, these intricate mobility, stability, crazy treatment plans, whipping out techniques, but it wasn't about that. It was about the use of positive language. And it wasn't positive language as we know it. It was replacing negative language and removing negative language. We weren't engaging in an overly being cheerful as we would think of as a positive approach. Like, okay, good job, Pete. That was awesome. Like, let's do that again. It wasn't like that. It was the acknowledgement that no can interfere with movement. And I think that story for me, and that case for me, really highlighted the power of the use of positive language or the absence of negative language and its influence on movement and influence on the emotional aspect of the client. I remember Pete after that session, because with that strategy, a week went by of treatment, and Pete was not necessarily able to do bed mobility independently, but he went from being a dependent transfer times 2 and a dependent for Hoyer setup to requiring like minimum assistance, which for him was huge. And I remember him looking into our eyes with a little smirk and a smile, and that look and that head nod, you could just tell Pete was very appreciative. And Pete will always remind me of the use of positive language, and I hope he will remind you of the use of positive language too. So that wraps up belief number 3, using a positive approach. So the 3 beliefs up to this point: I believe in the potential to change, and to bring out that potential, we need an ideal learning environment that coaches the whole person. That's the second belief, using a positive approach, and that's belief number 3. Next up, belief 4, we're going to talk about moving with intention. Thank you for listening, guys.